This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, welcome to today's session on tender, tasty Japanese turnips, growing turnips on the West Coast. We have Heather Ramsey here today from Umi Nami Farms to share all she knows about Japanese turnips. Before we jump into it, just want to do a quick land acknowledgement. Today I'm on the unceded ancestral territories of the Kikite and Kwikwetlem First Nations, but I'm sure we're all on different territories, and the seeds we grow have been around for generations from all across the world and all sorts of different indigenous nations. So just take a moment to thank the land that you're on. And with that, I'll pass it over to Heather. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, Siri. I'm excited to be here with you guys this evening. Thank you so much for having me. So I'll start by introducing myself and where I'm speaking to you from. My name is Heather. I have been farming at Umi Nami Farm for the past 13 years. Oh shoot, wrong button. This is Umi Nami Farm. We are here in Coast Salish territory, Chiano Nation, and we're in Machosen near Victoria, BC, down on the southern Vancouver Island. And what you see here is kind of a panorama of our farm. We're on a kind of valley bottom with a number of unheated greenhouses as well as outdoor fields. And in all this space that we manage, actually Japanese turnips are one of the key crops that we grow. Japanese turnips are called kabu in Japanese. I might sometimes flip into calling them kabu just because that's what I'm used to calling them, or I might go with the English Japanese turnips, and we'll see what kind of comes naturally as I'm speaking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and talk about a bit about the history and diversity of Japanese turnips. I'll talk about how we grow Japanese turnips. I'll talk about in general, what are some good practices for growing Japanese turnips to avoid a variety of problems. I'll share some tips about harvest stage, and at the end, I'll show some ideas for how to eat Japanese turnips, basically, and relate that to, our harvest quality and this kind of a thing. And hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. So, why grow Japanese turnips? As we were chatting just before everyone came in, I know I heard one of the reasons these were chosen is because they are a fairly quick crop that can finish easily. That is certainly one of the reasons why we grow them. They are, I won't say perfectly easy, they're relatively easy to grow in our climate, and they certainly are relatively fast depending on the season. But they're also delicious. And I hope you'll be really inspired by some of the recipes I'm going to share. They're also a really neat crop that has some very traditional uses as well as some very modern uses. They're a very common vegetable in Japanese cuisine. And because we specialize in Japanese vegetables, that's something that's very important to us. All right, so let's talk varieties. I'll just keep this slide up for now. So when you talk about Japanese turnips, a number of times I've had people come to the farm and be like, so do you grow Hakurei? And I'm kind of like, well, okay, let's take a step back. We don't grow Hakurei, but we do grow what you're referring to. And so there are actually thousands of varieties of Japanese turnips. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. One of the very popular varieties, one of the varieties that has popularized Japanese turnips here in North America is commonly known as Hakurei. It's actually Hakurei is how it would be said in Japanese, which means white hawk, which is a very, very pretty name. Somehow this variety was the one that got popular here. I don't know how or why. There's probably a story there that I don't know. Now, you're part of a seed trial, and so you already know that there's more than one variety of Japanese turnips. I've heard that you're also going to be testing snow in Tokyo and white eggs. So I was really happy to see right off the bat that you guys already know there's more than one variety out there. In North America, there are other varieties available through North American seed catalogues. Osborne Seeds has a number of varieties available. I've also seen in various other seed catalogues a variety called Tokyo Cross. I will admit from the outset, I have not tried, I have limited experience with these North American varieties. If we were to take a I'm going to take you on a little sort of like just mini trip to a Japanese seed catalog here in a sec. Now, this is just one seed catalog. This is from Taki Seeds. This is their 1998 seed catalog, which is just what we had on our shelf with pretty pictures in it. Here's one page showing 3 varieties, one of which is very traditional. This one here being a more traditional variety. This is more recently bred for disease resistance. Page 2, another 4 varieties. These are adapted for different seasons. Page 3, more varieties. These ones are more traditional types. You can see some different colors and shapes down here. These might all look the same, but there is another page here in the seed catalog outlining some of the differences between these varieties, which would include things like different textures, which might be good for eating in various ways, different leaf colors or different leaf textures, which might be nice for eating in different ways. There might be different levels of disease resistance. Some of these are hybrids that are designed for farmers to just like harvest real quick, like as soon as they're mature. Others are traditional varieties that would appeal to a home gardener because once they get mature, they'll still keep their quality for a few weeks before you really got to harvest them. And so this is just a very, very, very tiny snapshot of the variety of the diversity of Japanese turnips. Wikipedia suggests that turnips got to Japan kind of like 1300 years ago. There's actually been more than one introduction of turnips to Japan from the mainland. So we've already got a diversity of origins there. And then you have 1300 years of localized seed selection in different environments and X number of years of modern plant breeding, which there's a very strong plant breeding industry in Japan as well. And so out of that, you get thousands of varieties that most of us haven't seen here in North America yet. Now, what we grow is, of all that diversity, we only grow 2 usually. We grow this CR Yuki-Akari, it's called. It means snow light. We chose this variety. It's a hybrid variety. We chose it for 2 reasons. One is that it's resistant to clubroot. That's what the CR part refers to. I don't know about you guys, we are dealing with some level of clubroot in our soils. And so that's clubroot resistant trait is really important to us. We also find that this variety has a really nice eating quality, like the roots are kind of juicy. The leaves are really nice for salads and things like this, as long as they're grown under the right conditions. I'll say more about that later. And then we also grow this one, which is called Hinonakabu, and it's a more traditional variety. As you can see, it's kind of like an icicle turnip sort of a thing. It would traditionally be used for pickling and things like this, but you can use it in other ways as well. But we like to include like at least a little bit of a more traditional, a little bit off the beaten track variety as well. And so, yeah, that being said, I'm not really going to talk about growing these icicle types. I'm going to talk about growing the globe types, just because that's the type of varieties that you guys are going to be trialing. And also because we really focus more on the globe types. Like we plant like maybe like, I don't know, less than 10% of the turnips we grow are the icicle types, basically. And that's partly because they're less popular, partly because they're less disease resistant, kind of like that. All right, so what I'm going to do now is give a general overview of how we grow turnips and how the turnip crop develops from the seed to harvest. And then after that, I will go back through the same kind of ideas again in a different, more general way. So turnips, as you might know, are in the Brassica family. After you plant them, they look more or less like any other small seeded Brassica crop. Like maybe if I looked really hard, I could tell the difference between this and a bok choy, but I mean, they look kind of like any other little Brassica seedling. As they grow, developing a few more leaves now, they're a little bit more distinguishable as turnips. I wanted to show this picture in part because these seeds were all planted at the same time, but you can see that just little variations in, I don't know, maybe how much moisture they got. You see some fairly strong differences. It's all the same seed, but you get these ones looking far less healthy than these ones here. I wanted to show you this just because as you're trialing your seeds, some of the differences you're seeing may be simply environmental. This is all the same seed, but we're getting some fairly different results here. This is approximately the same stage as I just showed you there. What I wanted to show here is how you can already start to see the white of the root showing, but it hasn't really bulbed up yet, kind of a thing. As you start to get the leaves expanding into, say, like kind of like the 4th leaf stage-ish, depending on conditions, you can see the roots starting to kind of bulb up a little tiny bit. And then as we head into this kind of a stage, now we've actually got some that if you wanted to, you could harvest that. It would probably be a little on the tender side for cooking with, but you could do light cooking with it, or it would make a really nice salad, like this, the way it is right now. That being said, we usually wait till they're a bit bigger to harvest them. So this would be kind of like on the small end of what we would normally try to harvest. This is what they look like when we sell them. That's kind of like our standard size that we're going for. That being said, we do sell them both smaller and bigger than this, depending on the timing of the crop, depending on the conditions. In really good conditions, they can actually get kind of like that bigger round and still be perfectly good for eating. So that is the life of a turnip. The way we grow them, we typically plant them in rows with 6 or so furrows. We would put the furrows kind of like 6 inches or 15 centimeters apart. And this is actually sowed with a seeding machine. So we set it so that it's supposed to drop the seed every 3 inches or kind of like every 8 centimeters, whatever that works out to. Sometimes there's misses, sometimes there's seed dumps. So it's not actually perfect, but kind of like that's the idea. Again, talking about variability of conditions, this is all the same seed planted all the same time, all the same fertilizer. For some reason, this little patch of ground here didn't want to germinate turnips. It might be because it's wet. I'll talk more about how conditions affect turnip growth later. But again, I just want to encourage you that if you see this, it's not necessarily your seed or your fault. It's all the same seed, all the same person planting it. Everything's the same. For some reason, that place just didn't want to grow. So now, as I have said, we do sow them with a seeding machine. We aim for furrows 6 inches apart, seeds about 3 inches apart. We used to sow them by hand, so you certainly can do that. We used to make furrows kind of like just under 1 inch deep, and then hand drop the seeds at about roughly 3 inches. And then the crucial thing here is that you can't cover the seeds too much. If you cover them too much, they just won't come up through too much soil. So we aim to cover them. We use the same general rule of thumb you would use for many other crops, which is to cover the seed 2 or 3 times the depth that is like if you take the diameter of the seed and then do kind of like 2 or 3 times that much distance of soil above the seed. That's kind of what we aim for. Sometimes it might be more or less kind of a thing, but that's what we aim for more or less. And then we would usually just tap down the soil with the back of the rake or something like that if we were sowing by hand. Japanese turnips are one of our main crops. And so we do sow them once per week. We sow them inside an unheated greenhouse, which is what you see in the photo here. We do that from the beginning of February until the end of May-ish, depending on the weather. And then by that time, it's usually getting really warm in the greenhouse. So we actually switched to outdoor growing for June through early August. And then we're back in the greenhouse from mid-August until the end of September. Based on these planting dates, from those early February sowings, we can usually harvest turnips in about 10 weeks from the sowing date. Whereas in the summer, when it's like really warm, we can probably get that down to more like 6 weeks kind of a thing. So there's a fair bit of variability there. When we sow in late September, those are actually the ones that we overwinter. And so we'd be harvesting those like 4 or 5 months later, like in January and February kind of a thing. And so by sowing every week in this way, we can have turnips almost all year round. Not quite all year round, but almost all year round. We can produce turnips this way. Now, I don't want to give the impression that you need to have a greenhouse to produce turnips. We have greenhouse space, so we use it. We're also in a fairly cool microclimate. We're down in a little valley bottom where we don't actually get the full day length worth of sunlight. So depending where you are, you might be just fine planting outside from earlier in the season. I'm going to talk a little bit more later about how to pick the planting time for your region. Now, what I can say is that, so I've talked a bit about planting times and harvesting times. In terms of soil preparation, basically whatever, we do the same soil preparation for most of our vegetables. So the same thing that we would do for our Japanese greens, the mustard greens, the bok choy type things, that kind of a thing. It's the same soil preparation for the turnips. We don't do anything different. In terms of weed control, we usually go through with a little loop hoe and weed between the furrows at about 2 weeks after they germinate. And we find that usually takes care of most of it, but depending on the conditions, we might have to sometimes go through and hand weed in order to make sure they're not outcompeted by weeds. Yeah, and we use the same method both indoors and out, except that outdoors we cover them with floating row cover for a bunch of reasons that I'm going to talk about later. We find that the root size and leaf height vary a lot according to the growing conditions. In the early spring, we're typically getting smaller turnips with shorter leaves. As we go into, say, like the April and May sowings inside the greenhouse, we can actually get like very, very large roots with really, really tall tops that are still actually quite nice and tender. Outside in the summertime, even though it's warm, the tops tend to be smaller. I think it's just a little bit harsher growing conditions outside. So we tend to get shorter tops that aren't as tender. The roots tend to be bigger relative to the size of the tops, kind of a thing in the warmer weather. And then the ones that we overwinter tend to look a bit more like the spring sowed turnips, kind of a thing, with slightly shorter tops, smaller but still nicely sized roots. So having given you like a super quick overview of how we grow turnips, what I'd like to do is go through and talk about things that you could do and or should do in order to have a great turnip harvest under your own conditions. I'm just going to zoom out here so I can see what slides I have coming up. Oops, that does not help me. I will just toggle through. I think I can just stick with this slide for now. Okay, so soil and site selection is the basis of everything. So the first thing you need to do is to either select a great space or create a great space. For turnips, they would like to be in full to mostly full sun. We do have some parts of our farm that, as I said, are shaded in the for much of the day because we're in the valley bottom. We can still grow good turnips in those places. They'll just, you know, you can just get some slower growth when you have less sunlight. One thing that is really important is you need, especially when you're growing in the cooler seasons, you need to select a place that is not waterlogged. I've had times when it was early February and we really wanted to plant, and so we put seeds into this soil that was like pretty watery, and you know, you can really tell that the seedlings are not happy there. You know, like the little seed leaves come up and they look kind of yellow. The turnips might grow, but like, even though they look like they should be nice, small, tender turnips, they're already really tough. They're already hot tasting because they're all stressed out, this kind of a thing. So I really recommend, if you need to wait in order to have the right conditions, wait for the right conditions. If you can create the right conditions, say like maybe by making raised mounds that won't be so wet in the springtime, that might work, but you really need to have soil that's dry enough and warm enough in the spring. And then going into summer, it's usually the opposite problem, of course, making sure it's moist enough. But I find, especially as growers, we tend to want to get started early in the spring. And so I really tend to emphasize the spring conditions. Do not plant into waterlogged soil, do not plant into cold soil. It's not going to help you. I'll say a bit more about that when I talk about planting time. Now, another thing we find is fairly important is to choose soil that is relatively free of undecomposed organic matter. This might mean making sure that you have the right amount of time between applying compost and giving it enough time to decompose before you plant. It also might mean getting all the weeds out of the way before you mix up the soil and get ready to plant your turnips. I'm assuming here you're telling we-till. You might be doing a no-till method. But the reason why we try to avoid undecomposed organic matter in the soil is, for one, it can sometimes cause the turnip to kind of fork in weird ways. It can also cause blemishes on the skin. It can attract more insects in the soil, which could then feed on the turnips. And so, more so than for leafy greens, we really try to have clean soil for growing turnips in. We also try to avoid places with a history of wireworm or clubroot. I'm not going to go into super detail about those things. I'm going to hope that you guys will be able to look up more information based on my reference. I'm going to try to save the time as much as I can for like the core turnip, Japanese turnip related stuff. Now, that being said, if you're looking at your situation and you're like, I don't have a great spot to grow in, you can grow in containers. I was really excited to find, the computer's been slow here. We're going to go to the next slide. Oops, there we go. I found this really sweet video online of someone in Japan growing turnips in milk cartons. And so this was someone who went out and bought a bag of potting mix. And I don't know if this is their balcony or their kitchen or what, but they have turned everything from like a salad container to a milk carton into a space where they're growing like individual turnips in little individual containers. And they're getting some pretty nice turnips here, you know? And so not having great soil to work with need not stop you. There are all kinds of ways you can do this. Just make sure that it's warm enough and dry enough, also moist enough, but you know, you can get right conditions in a lot of different ways. Okay, this picture, I will talk about this picture in a moment. So I've talked about selecting or creating a good space. You also need to make sure you plant within the right window of time. As I said, we usually start our first turnips in early February, but that doesn't mean you can copy and paste that timing to your location. What I would say is that I like to think in terms of relative timing, like relative how other crops do within the season. So in our case, we start planting turnips a week or two after we start planting our leafy greens, such as bok choy and mustard greens. So if you kind of think about your own situation, when would you feel safe planting something like bok choy or mustard greens? If you can answer that question for yourself, maybe wait another week or two and then plant your Japanese turnips. That might be one way to kind of adjust. You could also just try doing it and accept failure or accept the unexpected success. But in terms of what we would consider reliable, we would wait a week or two after it's been safe to plant bok choy and mustard greens. As I said earlier, if you go too early, cold soil, poor germination, and or poor growth. If you really want to plant early, which as growers we often do, I would suggest try transplanting. We don't normally do that, but this year we tried doing it. We went with cell trays with like a really small cell, like the 1/128, if that means anything, just like these really little teeny tiny cells. So we sowed those as our first planting in February and transplanted them out exactly 4 weeks after that. And that actually gave us the stand of turnips you see right here. They grew really beautifully. If anything, it was better in a way because in that time of year, direct sowing would usually yield some fairly patchy growth, whereas we got like a beautiful stand of like basically every turnip was perfect kind of a thing. Maybe we also kind of got a little bit lucky, but transplanting can work. Just you need to transplant them before the root starts to kind of bulb up sort of a thing. But if you use some kind of small cells for making your seedlings, germinate them somewhere a little bit warmer, transplant only the good ones, that can also work. Now, in terms of planting window, I will say turnips are more of a cool season crop. In the summer, they're not going to hold for as long once they reach maturity. The leaves we find are usually not as nice for eating in the summertime because turnips, with Japanese turnips, we often do want to be able to eat the leaves as well as the root. That being said, you can still do it, and you can also just adapt your cooking method for the type of for the nature of the turnips you'll be harvesting. I'm going to talk more about that when I talk recipes. Now, when I talk about a planting window, I really do strongly recommend planting turnips several times through the year. I mean, one reason is simply you can enjoy them more that way. You have more opportunity to have a longer period to try different ways of eating them. As I mentioned earlier, you can, under the right conditions, overwinter them if possible. Also, as citizen scientists who are trialing these varieties, I strongly recommend successive planting, because then you're going to get to see how these varieties perform under different seasonal conditions and sort of metaphorically weed out those things that were just kind of a bit of a fluke sort of a thing. We do find, even within a single variety, considerable differences seasonally in the look of the turnips that we're harvesting. So I really recommend seeing how your varieties do under a variety of seasonal conditions from spring through summer through fall. So we've talked about space, we've talked about time. Now, one thing that is really important when you're growing many crops is spacing. I mentioned earlier that we try to grow ours in furrows 6 inches apart with 3 inches between turnips. That being said, some people in Japan grow theirs in a plastic mulch with the whole, these are actually onions here. I just wanted to show you the mulch so you know what I'm talking about. But this is 6 inches in every direction here. And so some people do grow their Japanese turnips in a mulch like this, 6 inches all direction, with 1 or 2 turnips in each hole. So you could make something like this out of a garbage bag, for example, and then plant, say, I don't know, 3 or 4 seeds in a hole, thin it to 1 or 2 good seedlings. And then you would simultaneously have weed control, some weed control, you still have to weed within the little patches, as well as sort of enforcing a certain spacing regimen kind of a thing. Just side note, if you do choose to grow this way, you might have more slug problems because slugs are really happy under the plastic, but it can work well under certain conditions, especially if you're willing to use some kind of slug bait to keep the slugs under control. But basically the idea being that to get, when you're, I mean, you can use Japanese turnips, even if they're just like these little teeny, like sort of dime sized things. Typically people are going for like golf ball to fist size sort of a thing. And if you want to get that, you're going to need to have them a little bit further apart, which means thinning them correctly. If you sowed more seeds than you need, it also means weeding correctly to make sure they're not being outcompeted by weeds. So having talked space, time, and spacing, another thing that is really important is to get the fertility right. That's my next photo here. Okay, we'll just stay here for now. The fertility you'll need to grow nice turnips is similar to other brassica vegetables, i.e. we grow our turnips in the same kind of soil as we would grow bok choy. That being said, our soil is no good at growing parsnips. What I mean by this comparison is you don't necessarily need the kind of soil that's great at growing root vegetables. Japanese turnips are a very fast crop, so they don't need the same type of nutrients that you'd need for things like really great carrots or really great parsnips. So if your soil, as I said, will grow good bok choy or good lettuce, it will probably grow good Japanese turnips as well. We typically do not side dress our crops with fertilizer, but I have read from one Japanese farmer that if you do choose to side dress your crops, avoid providing extra fertilizer before the turnips have started to bulb up. In his experience, if you provide extra fertilizer while they're still at that leaf stage, they will just produce a lot of leaves and kind of delay their root production. Whereas if you wait until they start to fatten up the root a bit, then more of those nutrients will grow into making a nice root. On the fertility note, you will want to avoid excess nitrogen. So don't go overboard on your fertilizer trying to get good crops. Excess nitrogen, as with many other crops, can give you more aphids. In our experience, the ladybugs will eventually show up and deal with the aphids, but their timing is not our timing. By the time they do that, the turnips will probably be past the stage that you ideally want to be eating them at. Now, I know it might sound gross, but aphids are edible. If you're doing this as a home crop, like when we're going to sell, it's hard to sell crops with aphids on them. As a home gardener, if you want to just wash them off, or if you want to just turn a blind eye and eat them, of course, that's also totally fine. That being said, most of us would prefer to have our crops without so many aphids on them. Really super funny side story. I made a really great broccoli soup once with tons of aphids on it and actually just made it really nice and creamy. And we just didn't tell everyone that there was aphids in it, and it turned out just fine. So yeah, you can, if you do get aphids, there are ways to either live with it or, as I said, wash them off. But you can also just avoid that by not giving them too much nitrogen in the first place. So space, time, spacing, fertility. The other thing that you could / should do when you're growing turnips is floating row cover. We use floating row cover in 2 ways. When we're growing inside the greenhouse, after we sow the seeds, we typically put floating row cover on top simply to keep moisture in the soil until they germinate. Once they germinate, we take it off so that they don't get leggy, so that they get the maximum amount of light. And that's the only use we would make of the floating row cover while they're in the greenhouse. That being said, the second way we use it, which is super important when we're growing outdoors, we use floating row cover for the full life cycle of the crop. The reason being that there are all kinds of things, creatures, who would like to share the turnips with us. If we did not put on floating row cover, we would deal with cabbage maggot, those little green worms from the cabbage butterflies, birds, rabbits, flea beetles. If that was not enough, we are in a very windy site and the wind would very quickly make it very hard for our turnips to grow properly. So the simple fact of putting row cover on already just deals with a whole host of problems right there. We do find it's fairly important for us to go through and patch holes in the row cover. We just use some kind of tape up the holes in the row cover because many of these pests will find any hole whatsoever they can get. Now, we're using that sort of spun bonded stuff that's commonly referred to as rime. I have seen netting out there that's fine enough that it probably would do the same thing. So if you want to try using a net of some kind, you could go for that. Now, depending on your environment, you may or may not need it that badly. You could just try without it and see if you come out fine. And maybe you don't need it as badly as we do. We do find for us it is absolutely essential, or we would just simply not get a good crop at all. Now, when we use the floating row cover outside, as I said, we're patching holes. We're also digging a little trench on either side of our bed and burying the edges of the floating row cover. It is a lot of work, but it is worth it. We definitely find that we get much better results if we keep things covered that way. Like I said, in your situation, depending on your pest pressures and this kind of a thing, maybe you need it, maybe you don't, I don't know. But if you are dealing with the kinds of pests I've just rattled off there, floating row cover with the edges buried, really good thing to do. Now, I've mentioned a number of pests, but as well as wind as problems that you might have to deal with. Now, there are some problems that even floating row cover can't solve. And one of those is slugs. We definitely have fairly high slug pressure here, more in the spring and fall than in the summer, but we definitely have fairly high slug pressure. We do use Sluggo, which is kind of like Safer's slug bait sort of a thing. It's like an organically acceptable slug bait. We use it, we try not to use it too much. What we typically do is after we plant, we'll water the crop in and then we'll sprinkle slug bait on the surface. And the reason we do it right away is because the slug bait typically gives you 2 weeks worth of protection. And that 2-week window allows the crop to germinate and get just big enough that it will probably survive a little bit of slug damage. If we really have high slug pressure, we might go through later and scatter slug bait on the paths just to, give some extra protection there. But we find typically in our own situation, which is fairly slug prone, that one application is good enough. In terms of the timing of the application, what we sometimes do in the really early season when it takes like a week and a half plus to germinate the crop, we'll sometimes wait a week before applying the slug bait, just so that way we really maximize its efficacy for the period when the seedlings are just coming up, when they're just forming their true leaves. But we find this makes a really big difference to us in being able to get a nice crop of turnips without too much slug damage, kind of a thing. The other hazard you'll have to watch out for, particularly in the cold season, is rats. We've had, particularly in our overwintered turnips, times when the rats will go through and it's like they feel the need to sample every single turnip to see which one is the best turnip, kind of a thing. Again, like, I mean, I will admit, we'll still eat these for home use. We'll cut out the part the rat ate and then eat the rest of it ourselves. Someone who's trying to grow and sell, of course, that doesn't really fly. Also, you may not feel comfortable cutting out rat bites to eat it yourself, kind of a thing. And so I'm just warning you ahead of time, this is something you might deal with. I wish I had a great solution. We try to keep a healthy population of farm cats. We use rat traps when we feel it's safe to do that without hurting other animals. There's not really a great solution to this. If you're able to exclude them with a cage of some kind around what you're growing, maybe that can work. I guess what I would just say is just please do not use rat poison. It can have a lot of other off-target effects that I don't want to see happening out there. Now, having talked about a bunch of different environmental factors and pests and so on, one other big point for having great turnips is knowing when to harvest them. Now, as I've mentioned earlier, you can harvest them at pretty much any stage. Like these little tiny things that are just leaves, if you thin them out, those can go in your salad. That little teeny tiny turnip I showed you earlier, when its root has just started to get a little bit round, that could make a beautiful salad, you know? That being said, we are typically speaking, people are going for those sort of golf ball through fist-sized roots is kind of like the norm. That's not, you don't have to aim for that, but that's the norm that people are going through. Typically, that would be possible within, say, 10 weeks in the early season, within 6 weeks in the summer season, on the other side of winter, if you're doing overwintered turnips. But the thing is that how long you can wait to harvest after that initial harvest time really varies with the season. In the early spring, you could probably get a tour. I mean, or in our case anyways, we would anticipate being able to stretch harvest out over 2 or 3 weeks. 3 weeks would be pushing it, 2 weeks would be safe. That being said, in the summertime, when it's warm and things are growing really quickly, there's no way on the face of this planet we're getting 2 or 3 weeks out of that crop. You really have to make sure to harvest it a lot more quickly within a week or maybe 2-ish. If we do not harvest them in time, what's going to happen is that the skin will get tough. The root will get these tough fibers going through it. The leaves might start to get tough. Depending on the season, it also might start to bolt. We find bolting is particularly a challenge with the overwintered turnips, where they've been through the winter, they're feeling spring, they're feeling like getting their seeds going. While I'm mentioning the overwintered turnips, whereas with the spring and summer ones, we would just go mostly by time for deciding when it's time to harvest. With the overwintered ones, what we would do is we would look, I mean, we would certainly look for a nice size to be like, okay, it's big enough now, I want to harvest it. But what we find is when they're thinking about starting to make flower shoots, the inner leaves turn a slightly paler color. They also push up a little bit, which you can see. And when you see that combination of that slight color change and that little bit of push up, you really need to get on harvesting them as soon as possible, because they are going to make a flower shoot. And once they make their flower shoot, they are not going to be very nice for eating anymore. So be aware of how seasonality is going to affect your initial harvest, how seasonality is going to affect the length of your harvesting window. And what I would say with this is there's a really big tendency, at least among our customers, to assume that smaller turnips equals more tender. That is not necessarily the case. It can be the case, but I have seen times when we grew turnips under really stressful conditions, i.e. really cold, waterlogged, and they stayed really small, but got all those features of old turnips, the thick skin, the fibers, the strong taste, this kind of a thing, without getting big. That being said, under really ideal conditions where they're growing really quickly and they have all the water and nutrients they want, I've seen them get that big and still be tender all the way through. And the tops are like that tall and they're still really nice for eating. And so don't judge the turnip by its size. If you have nice growing conditions, you'll tend to get nice turnips. Exactly what size they get to will depend on a bunch of different factors. And when it comes to the harvest, use size a little bit as a guide, but use timing also really strongly as a guide for how soon and until when you try to harvest them. All right, what time are we at here? Oh my, it is almost question time. I would like to just very briefly share some ideas for eating Japanese turnips. I'll just see if I have any slides left here. Nope, that's it. I'm just going to change my screen share. Please just bear with me while I do that. Oops, new share. Okay, what I have done is I have lined up a bunch of different websites that have some recipe ideas on them. I'm going to play some short video clips and show you some photos. I will provide these links later so they're available for you to look at yourself. Now, before I dive into any of these, if we have time to dive into them, which I really hope we do, what I will say is that there are so many different ways to eat Japanese turnips. There are traditional ways to eat them raw. There are modern ways to eat them raw. There are traditional ways to cook them and pickle them, and there are modern ways to cook them and pickle them. What I would say is that when you're choosing how to eat your turnips, of course, part of it is your own taste, but part of it is the combination of seasonality and quality. So in the cooler seasons, we tend to get turnips that are milder flavored and more tender. These are really nice for raw eating. You can also cook with them, but you'll want to cook them more lightly so they don't just turn to mush. That being said, in the summer, when it's hotter and they grow more quickly and they can change flavor more quickly, you may find that they're not as nice for raw eating. We certainly find with ours, the leaves aren't as nice for eating in the summertime. And so in the summertime, we might focus more on eating only the root part and maybe on stewing it or pickling it or cooking it in some other kind of way. Now, in terms of raw eating, a simple Western style salad, you can chop the whole thing up, leaves and root, and it could go great in something like that. There is also a traditional, sort of, you call it a salad. It's also known as an instant pickle called momizuke. And in the very little time we have before question period, I'll show you a quick clip from a video that we made. Now you can let me know if this is playing correctly or not over Zoom. If it's not, then I'll simply provide the link. I don't think this video wants to play. Okay, I think that we are going to nix this because it's taking too long. And will it let me pause? Okay, well.
There we go. We've got all this nicely cut up now. So by going by feel, what I would do is I would take probably about that much salt for this much vegetables. This also depends a lot on your personal taste. If you want it saltier, do it saltier. If you want it less salty, do it salty. But that's about how much salt I would start with. This amount.
Now, just hear the background.
With clean hands. Now what we're going to do. Sorry, what was that, Siri?
Oh, I think it's okay.
It's okay.
You just couldn't see the video. It was on the other page.
What could you not see?
The video playing.
Okay. Maybe I should, we're like right up against question time right now. So I think I'm going to summarize the recipe stuff really quick and then provide a bunch of links. How does that sound, do you think?
That sounds great. Yeah.
Okay. So what I was trying to show you guys here is a traditional sort of what you could call an instant pickle. What we do is we just literally cut the whole turnip bite-sized, put it in a bowl, and then with sprinkle a little bit of salt on it, and then with clean hands, you just massage it until the vegetable juices start to come out. You can massage it more or less depending on your taste. Add a bit of vinegar, and you can serve it right away. You can also leave it in the fridge for a couple of days to like get a more sort of pickle-esque nature to it. That's one super easy way to eat it if they're nice and tender. That being said, if the turnips are, in the summertime, maybe a little bit on the stronger flavored side, you can try eating them raw. If you like them raw, that's great. They're also really lovely in something like miso soup. They're also really lovely if you just kind of stew them lightly in your favorite broth. I've also seen people wrap them in foil and bake them. I've never done it myself, but some people love just like putting them on the barbecue and doing them as grilled vegetables, or in the oven, like covered in oil and as grilled vegetables. I'll include a link for the oven version of the grilled vegetables when I send those out later. And so there are so many different ways to enjoy eating these ones. If you would like to talk more details about that, we can bring that out in question time, but I think we're like right up against the time that we set aside for questions. And so thank you. That was a lot of information. Just, yeah, please let me know if there's anything you'd like to ask about.
Great, so you guys are welcome to unmute yourself if you have any questions, but we did have someone ask, could you use wire mesh to support row covers, which would keep rats out? Which I'm sure you haven't done, but.
I haven't done that, but I have friends who have built some version of wire cage over their vegetables. I think the key would just be making sure that it's buried in the ground so they can't just get under it, kind of a thing. But I would imagine it can be done. So.
Okay, cool.
I was curious about all the varieties that there are in all those catalogs. What percentage of them do you feel like are hybrid, and how many are open pollinated? Are they more commonly hybrid varieties? And
I would say I would say that I don't have a good feel for that. My guess, there's a lot of traditional varieties. Japan's topography is very varied. Like you have Okinawa tropical in the south, and then Hokkaido like colder than here in the north. You have all kinds of mountains separating out different microclimates. There was a period in Japanese history where for political reasons, people weren't allowed to move around. And so like a lot of regional varieties developed. And so there's like really, really thousands of traditional varieties hiding in different corners of Japan. That being said, there's also a very rich plant breeding, like modern plant breeding practice in Japan. And so I'm going to guess that there's more traditional varieties out there, but that maybe the modern varieties are more popular now, like maybe like in the seed catalog, there might be kind of like almost half and half sort of a thing. But if you want to go digging, there's a ton of traditional variety out there kind of a thing. That would be my just my instinctive feel for it kind of a thing, you know?
Mhm. That would be my guess too. I just
yeah. I do really love the variety. There's yeah, it's really beautiful. It's really beautiful. So I see a hand up from Sandra.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine, thanks.
Wonderful. I planted our turnips on the 9th of April and they started coming up yesterday.
Oh, okay. So like 9th of April. So that's like, trying to do some quick math in my head right now. That's like 2 weeks kind of a thing?
Just over 2 weeks, yeah, about 2.5 weeks.
Yeah.
That's about right.
Yeah, that under cold conditions, that's normal. Yeah.
Okay, and I've got them under Remy cloth. I did that because we have a lot of birds.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to dissuade them because I noticed the first time that we had them, I had actually a glass originally over them, like, you know, greenhouse glass.
Yeah.
And because they're in raised beds.
Yeah.
And the birds figured out how to get one corner. And so I saw them playing in there and I thought, okay, all right, we'll go with the cloth because then they don't see them.
Yeah, I know. We have trouble with birds getting in our greenhouses too. It just is. They'll find like if there's a crack under the door, they'll get in under the crack under the door. If there's a window that doesn't have mesh over it, they'll get in through the window sometimes. Yeah.
You know, so far so good, but I just wanted to make sure that that was pretty normal for this time of year. It's been, yeah, okay, because it's been quite cold, so I know that, but yeah, okay, perfect, thank you.
That's completely right. So that's why I was saying when, like, if one were to choose to do slug bait under your conditions, that's one of those situations where I would delay my slug bait application because you don't really need it in the first week kind of a thing. If I'm under kind of conditions like that, where I can expect a kind of 2-week-ish germination period, I'd apply the slug bait kind of like a week after planting or something like that, if you're going to do that at all.
I know that's great. And just to let you know, we're blessed with no slugs.
Oh, wow, that's amazing.
Yes.
That is beautiful. Good stuff.
So yeah, so far, and we've got a backup plan of ducks if it gets to be a problem.
That's perfect. That's so beautiful.
Thank you.
Great. And if anybody else has any questions, feel free to unmute or leave it in the chat. That was really interesting. I learned a lot about turnips.
Thank you.
I'm hungry right now for
I'm glad. That's fantastic.
eat them.
It's
I really do. I really do love them. I feel like the first time I ever had them, all I did was, they were quite small. I think I threw the whole thing in the stir fry. Like, I don't even know if I chopped them up. I just put them in whole tops, bottoms. They were so good.
Yeah.
One other thing I noticed when we were sourcing the seeds is, and again, maybe it has to do with the OP and the hybrid, but the price difference in the seed, like the Hakurei hybrid F1 compared to the white egg turnip, I'm pretty sure it was about 40 times the cost. Like it was, and I was shocked at how cheap the white egg turnips were as well. But do you find that as well? Or I guess you found your variety that you use pretty regularly.
Yeah, I guess we've kind of honed in on that one variety I showed you. And so we, at this point, we just kind of buy it and don't think about the price sort of a thing. But I'm not surprised. Like, I mean, that's pretty standard with seeds, is that, the special F1s are going to be a lot more expensive. And I guess especially if for the seed company you're getting it from, if Japanese turnips aren't a big thing for them, then all the more so kind of a deal,
Have you tried saving seed from them before?
Oh, I haven't. Now, I've only been here for part of the lifetime of the farm, so I mean, it's possible that someone before me did, but I don't have experience seed saving with them.
But the variety you grow is also a hybrid, right?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
It would be very feasible.
No. The other one we grow, which is more of the icicle type, that is an OP, and so we could theoretically do it. We just haven't, sort of a thing. No, wait a minute, did we? We grow a lot of crops, so I lose track sometimes. I'm not always the one with my hand in it, kind of a thing. But yeah, we don't normally do it. We normally buy them. Now, what was I going to say again? Do you guys know what traits you're planning to evaluate when you do your trial?
Yes, we have a whole bunch of traits. So I'll look it up, but we ask people for the date that they plant it. And if they are choosing to transplant it, we also ask for the transplanting date. And then the first couple traits that people will be starting to evaluate is germination. And then we do everything just on a 1 to 5 scale. So it's kind of encouraging people to, compare the varieties a bit. And then we have our vigor, which is kind of, to me, that would be kind of for Japanese turnips, how fast it kind of leaps out. And then we're also looking for earliness, flavor, insect resistance, uniformity, and yield.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I was just trying to think to myself, what would be some traits that, I guess just having looked through some of the catalogs, like what were some of the traits that were kind of like being recommended in different varieties? Yeah, definitely germination and growth under various seasonal conditions. I know, like in some of the seed catalogs I was showing you, like there's varieties that are more adapted to warm versus cold growing conditions. I would also be really interested to hear about not only the root quality, but also the leaf quality. Because not in my experience, but in what I've heard from some of the other people who farm together with me, was that some of the varieties we tried and were rejected partly because the leaves were a lot tougher, kind of a thing. Like we chose our variety because it has tender leaves that are nice for eating. Not all varieties are necessarily going to be equally tender in their leaves. And since that's part of the package that you get to eat, I mean, okay, depends what you want. Like if you don't want leaves, then that's fine. But like, I mean, if you want leaves, then the eating quality of the leaves, it might actually be a separate trait from the root eating quality, kind of a deal. And I don't know how easy it is for people to evaluate this, but again, like different varieties will hold longer or shorter over their harvest period. Like in those slides I showed you from that seed catalog earlier, there's one particular variety in there that's a traditional variety that this one particular farmer specifically recommends because it holds for a fairly long time with nice quality, so you can harvest it over a few different weeks, kind of a thing. So I don't know if those are traits that are possible that people want to evaluate, but those are just things that from my reading / my experience affect our experience of Japanese turnips, kind of a thing.
I think one you mentioned earlier too, I don't know if we can add it to our trial, but the clubroot resistance around here would be something really awesome for growers that are affected with that.
I know there is. Oh, sorry.
It would be good to have disease resistance instead of just insect.
I know that there are a few, if you found a clubroot resistant variety, if the one you grow is, I know that there's also a variety, I think Osborne offers that's clubroot resistant.
I was about to say that.
And I know that that's what they use at our farm, and they won't grow anything that's not clubroot resistant, because when you lose a crop, you lose the whole crop.
I know, exactly. It's really frustrating. Yeah. And that Niseko that they have at Osborne Seeds, like that's a Japanese bred variety. The only reason we don't use it is that we've already got something that we're using, kind of a thing. But definitely if people need a clubroot resistant variety and they don't mind growing a hybrid, then Niseko from Osborne Seeds is a great choice. So
That makes sense. Yeah, I think maybe I'll encourage folks to, when they rate their flavor, you can add comments, maybe commenting on the leaves, how the leaves compare to the roots.
Yeah.
I always find sometimes the qualitative data is just as interesting as the quantitative, or gives you more details, if anything.
Definitely.
Now I'm excited to dehybridize a hybrid clubroot resistant variety and select an open pollinated clubroot
That
resistant
sounds
variety.
phenomenal.
We're on to another
Phenomenal.
10-year breeding project.
I'm seeing a note. Oh, I have not checked the chat at all. Okay, I'm getting very hungry now too. Yes. Thanks for that overview. You've got me really stoked to see these plants mature. Yeah. No, they do grow really slowly in the spring, but that's just growing conditions. I mean, like I said, for us, it would be like easily 10 weeks to harvest in the spring versus 6 in the summer, kind of a thing. So, and depending on your conditions, it could vary a little bit, kind of a deal. Sluggo, yes. Yeah, Sluggo is the one we use. There's also Safer's slug bait. I think I've seen Sluggo repackaged as Slug Begone. So there's a few different ones out there.
I wasn't sure. I was looking that up too. I'm not sure. Slug Begone may not be the Omri certified version.
Really?
So
Okay.
I think Sluggo is, there might be something else in there that's not allowed in organic systems.
Okay. So we got to read labels carefully then. So.
Great. Well, we're coming up to the hour. That was really awesome, Heather. Really liked it. Oh, looks like somebody's waiting to plant them tomorrow. Oh, that's awesome.
Okay.
Hopefully that works out well for you.
I am really interested to hear how your guys' trials go. Like, I mean, I think it's really awesome that this is happening. And yeah, thank you for having me. It was lovely to see those of you who I know and nice to meet those of you who I don't. So yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I'm going to stop the recording.